Hello students, and welcome to Mr. Little's History Bites. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 16, Part 2, The Christian World. At the end of this history bite, you'll be able to answer these essential questions. How did Christianity influence the daily life in both Western and Eastern Europe during this time? And 2, how did Christianity influence the politics in both Western and Eastern Europe during this time? So really quick, let's go over the basics of Christianity. You may be familiar with this already if you live in the United States, as the majority of individuals here are followers of Christianity. But Christianity centers on the teachings of a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who lived about 2,000 years ago. And Jesus and his followers believed that he was the promised savior of the Jewish people. And later followers, including Paul the Apostle most famously, would incorporate non-Jews into this growing religion that's centered on Jesus of Nazareth, sometimes called Jesus Christ. And this religion was eventually adopted by the declining Roman Empire around 300 CE. And by the end of the empire, it had become the largest religion in the Mediterranean. And then the years following the defeat and the collapse of the Roman Empire, it actually spread to Northern and Eastern Europe via the work of missionaries. The most famous of which, in my opinion, is Cyril and Methodius, who we'll talk about shortly. Now, in Western Europe, the Christian church was dominated by something we call the papacy, which was centered in Rome. And the head of the papacy was somebody called the Pope, which you also might already be familiar with. But the Pope was considered God's representative on earth, not a successor to Jesus, but the representative of God on earth. And the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. And while every major city had a bishop, the bishop in Rome was considered to be very special in particular. One of the more famous popes was Pope Gregory I, virtually an independent ruler. He had a large chunk of territory he ruled called the Papal States. Now, during this time, because of the instability and disorder caused by the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, a very popular way of life was something called monasticism. Monasticism is where individuals withdraw from public life and live in a monastery, which requires them to live a life of thoughtful contemplation, as well as reading and education of the Bible and other Christian texts. Monasteries are isolated from the rest of society. They're meant to be in hard-to-reach places or far-away places. But there are strict rules governing monastic society. Not just anybody can become a monk. And in the West, St. Benedict, and in the East, St. Basil, both set up rules for what it meant to be a monastic monk. What did you have to do to be a monk? And it should be noted that for both men, but especially for women, monastic life represented a very real alternative to the existing social structure. If you were not happy with your life, you could go become a monk, and it potentially offered you an alternative way to live. So, a very popular thing between the year 600 and 1100 CE. Now, in Western Europe at the time, the smaller rulers and the smaller lords often sought legitimacy via the papacy and via the Pope. Some rulers, most famously Charles Martel, who came right before Charlemagne, waged wars in the name of protecting Christianity. Charlemagne himself was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo around 800 CE. So not only was the papacy important in supporting empires, in this case, they literally made the empire by crowning the emperor. And local lords oftentimes supported monasteries and churches to demonstrate their piety. So they would demonstrate their piety by giving lots of money to a local church or to pay for a local relic. And this is how they demonstrated how good and Christian they were. In Eastern Europe, the Christian church was under the control of the Byzantine Empire and very subject to a lot of influence from the emperor himself. Whereas the West had bishops, the East had a group known as the patriarchs, and the patriarchs were in a number of major cities. And while they officially acknowledged the authority of the Pope in Rome, they were also effectively independent and free to pursue their own policies. For example, around 700 CE, there's something called the iconoclasm controversy, in which in the East, for a short time, patriarchs and church officials destroyed or removed images of Jesus of Nazareth or his followers, the belief that these were leading people astray. Now, this didn't last very long, and pretty soon everybody went back to acknowledging icons in churches as an aid to worship, but not actually to worship itself. But the fact that this was something in the East and not in the West was a harbinger of things to come. There were continuing debates over who actually had authority, the bishop in Rome or the emperor in Constantinople, right? There were debates over the nature of Jesus of Nazareth. Was he all human? Was he all God? Was he human and God? Which again sounds silly, but it was a real big question. Also, when is Easter? When is the time that Jesus rose from the dead, allegedly? And these debates eventually broke the two churches into two into something called the Great Schism. And from this point onward, the church in the West is sort of referred to as the Catholic Church, and the church in the East, and all of its denominations, are referred to the Orthodox churches. Now, the Byzantine emperors saw themselves as the successors to their Roman ancestors, and in many ways they were. Now, ancient Roman emperors had been considered divine. Julius Caesar had been famously described as a god, but the Byzantine emperors could not claim they were gods or even like semi-god, because that would have gone against everything the Christian church teaches. However, much like the Chinese in the Mandate of Heaven, the Byzantine emperors claimed a certain favor to rule, and this policy is something called Caesaropapism, that is the papacy of Caesar, and this has also kind of contributed to that split between the East and the West. The emperors of the Byzantine Empire also built large monuments, large cathedrals, such as the Hagia Sophia in what is now Istanbul, which at the time was the largest church in the entire world and would remain so for a very long time. They also waged wars against non-Christians, specifically the Persians, as well as later the Arabs, and then after the rise of Islam, the Arab Muslims. They also sent out missionaries to Christianize the Slavic peoples of the north. And in particular, they sent out two missionaries called Cyril and Methodius, who not only converted the Slavic peoples of the Balkans and what is now Russia, but they created a script for them, which is still used today. It is the modern Cyrillic script. So you should be able to answer those essential questions. Thank you so much for joining me on this History Bite, and I will see you next time.